So today's topic is going to be mystery shopping and festival observation, and we have a few different examples that we're going to present to everyone, and then some questions at the end about whether and how these methods are still of interest to you, either from the individual perspective of maybe wanting to collect some observation data at your own festival, or whether you're not so interested in that, but you would love it at some other EvalFest sites to take that on and maybe learning. So that's where we're headed over the next hour. If you are not muted but could mute your mic, that would be great. And if you're one of our speakers and mute, then I will remind you to unmute when we get to your portion of the talk. Thanks. Okay, so here's another way to look at it. I wanted to find some ways for people to share some in-the-trenches experiences with trying to observe interactions at festivals. And we have two examples of those. One is going to focus on scientists' interaction with the public. The other is going to focus on parent-child interactions that take place within the context of a festival expo. And we're going to hear teams. MSU is going to go first. We're going to hear from Renee and Miles. And then we have Kaya, who has not been able to be involved in EvalFest up until now, but is going to probably start playing a larger role, if I understand correctly, as part of that team. And those three are our shout-outs. So thank you for being willing to take this on and to share your experiences today. I'm also going to give a shout-out to Gina. Gina is hot off the heels of her 2016 festival, which happened a little bit over a week ago, and they tried the mystery shopping protocol at their festival as well. And so I'm going to invite her to speak up and share some feedback in a little bit, with the hope that we'll all benefit from hearing her perspectives too. Okay, so I am going to give the driver's seat over to Renee and Miles. Oops, except I didn't do that, sorry. So Renee and Miles, you guys should have control now of the mouse and be able to forward your slides.
Okay, Renee here. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm coordinator of the MSU Science Festival, and I'm just gonna go and present these slides. Miles is in another room, and he's going to observe, and he'll chime in probably via text as needed. So let's see. The MSU Science Festival, we've utilized an attendee survey since we began, but we didn't really have a good way of assessing the quality of our individual presentations. So even though we offered workshops on communication techniques, they weren't super well attended, and we didn't really have a good way of judging how things were going. We have a small core organizing team as well, and so we really weren't able to be in as many places as we would have liked to really get a sense of how presenters were doing, what kind of support they needed, what kind of guidance they needed in regards to presenting in this informal, more broad-based audience. And so we kind of needed a little bit more input. My screen is kind of going weird. I've got a couple of other files open, but I'll just keep going. Let's see. So when I joined up with EvalFest, and let's see, what is all of this? I don't think this is mine. I'm not sure what's going on with the screen. I can't control that. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Sorry, Renee. Hang on one sec.
Okay, yeah. I'll just keep talking, though. Unfortunately, my slides are mostly text anyway. It was something that we asked not to do, but I did it anyway. I'm sorry about that. But anyway, When I attended the EvalFest conference last year and came across the mystery shopper, I thought that this was a really great way and informal way that we could assess and meet the needs that we needed and assess our presenters in a way that wasn't very intrusive or in a way that wouldn't make our presenters feel as if they were being overtly critiqued. We really convey a supportive, our intention of support, and we wanted our presenters to feel as comfortable as possible. So this seemed like a really nice match. And I also like the idea that this type of review seemed like it could potentially evolve over time and meet different needs that we wanted over and might need to explore over time. So let me see, page down. Okay. We had about 15 different questions on our 15 different questions on our survey. We call it a presentation review. We didn't use the technical mystery shopper title. And we used the original mystery shopper form as a template or guide in the creation of ours. And we, my team and I, created the form, and then we had Miles look it over to make sure there weren't any major glaring problems with how we structured the questions, etc. And so he was really great in giving us some feedback on that. This slide shows some samples of what we did. Most of our questions were yes-no questions. They explored particular elements that we were hoping our presenters would include in their presentations. They were most of them were included on our tip form that we had on our website and that we sent to our presenters, and they were also covered in the workshops that we offered, but they weren't always very well attended. So we wanted to see just how much of this information was getting to our presenters. Let's see. Some of the questions kind of surprised us in regards to the results that we had. Let me see. Of these questions, our surveys covered a total of 81 different events. 52 of them were talks, seminars. 21 of them were expo. 4 of them were panels, and 4 of them were tours. We had, for the hands-on activities, let me see. I was really kind of surprised about this because we had 67% of our expo had an activity that people could actually interact with and engage in, which was really surprising to us because that's where you expect the majority of hands-on activities to be occurring. So, and then we had many people related their work and their topic to real-world examples. We had 94% of them said yes, and so we were really pleased about that, at least for our seminars. Again, only 51% of our expos were able to do that, and let's see, some other outstanding things that we had. 66% of our presenters let's see, shared their specific works and studies and how it related to what topic it was they were presenting. And so all of this kind of information was really valuable to us. A lot of our other topics, such as convey an enthusiasm for their topic, did they know the material well? Questions such as that, they scored really well. But these certain elements we really were hoping would be included in the presentations, and it gave us some insight. Let me see. Anything else? Whoops. I did something wrong. Uh-oh.
Don't panic.
There we go. Okay. All right, training field researchers. Again, this was a really informal use of this form, and so we didn't really have a whole lot of training. We, in consulting with Miles, we determined that an IRB wasn't required because it wasn't, formal research going on. This was really observation. We really just wanted it to inform how we could better communicate to our presenters and be supportive of them and help their presentation to be as good as it possibly could be. Let's see. We did want, again, it to be anonymous. We really didn't want the presenters to feel as if somebody, a representative of the SciFest organizing team was reviewing them and being critical of their presentation. So we did ask our volunteers not to wear their SciFest volunteer T-shirt, and we did ask them to fill out the form outside of the site of the presenter. We let the volunteers choose what they wanted to review because this was a way that they could contribute to the festival in a meaningful way, in addition to whatever other responsibilities they had as volunteers, but also get a glimpse of some of the great stuff that's being offered. That's one of the frustrating things with being an organizer, is that we don't often have the time to go to any of the presentations that are being offered. But this was something that we did want to make sure our volunteers had the opportunity to benefit from, and this was one way to do it, and also have their eyes and ears out there to come back and tell us what they experienced. Let's see. That's pretty much it there. Let's see what else. Yep. On the form, we did ask that the volunteers didn't need to include their name on the form, but we did ask them to include their age. Let's see. As a requirement, we decided that we wanted high school age volunteers or older to be completing these forms. We felt that at that age we would start benefiting from an increased level of maturity and a lower need for supervision or guidance, and so we wanted to do that. And we had some scout groups and we had some honor groups that wanted to participate and volunteer, and so we needed some tasks that they could do that would also feel good to them as well. So we asked for 14 years of age and older. In regards to getting and going over the procedures, we emailed the form out to the volunteers that were participating in this. We also did a brief review of the form just before their shift started. Some volunteers had additional responsibilities. They might have, for part of their shift, been manning an information booth or distributing and checking with our presenters as whether or not they needed water or other needs that they might have had, or running program booklets to different locations. But outside of those other responsibilities, we asked them to do these mystery reviews, and for a particular shift, we asked for a certain number of reviews to be done if they could squeeze them in. So they picked up the forms at the beginning of the shift and then turned them in to a SciFest team leader at the end of their shift, and that was that. We did convey to them, too, that the intention of this was to really just observe, make note of these elements that we were looking for, and that the intention is to be supportive of our presenters. That was really important to me. Let me see. Using the data, we didn't have a whole lot of time to formally review the data and create a spreadsheet. That's almost done, but it still was never really fully completed. But my team members and I, we did read through all of them and we discussed them, and the responses that we had did directly impact how we chose to phrase our presentation tips that we have on our website. It affected how we decided to distribute those tips to different people, to our presenters. We also emphasized different elements to different types of presentations. And so we found that this information was really informative, and we were probably a bit more assertive in getting this information out to people. We are still really curious, too, about what kind of correlation there might have been between the responses that we received regarding these key elements and what the overall rating was of these presentations. So we had one of our non-yes and no questions was the how do you rate the presentation, poor, fair, good, very good, or excellent. And so I'd really like to know just long-term how those ratings related to the responses to the other questions that we had. Let me see. Anything else on that? Okay. So again, I found that this questionnaire offered valuable insight to what was going on. I really liked having our volunteers do this. I liked how they responded to it. They responded very positively to being able to contribute in this way and provide the feedback in their experience in these sessions. It was really useful to us because we could not be everywhere we wanted to be. I found that, and I feel that this questionnaire could be adapted long-term, adjusting the questions to the different needs that we have over the years. I think that to some degree, these particular questions might not be as necessary depending on how many new presentations we have coming in over time. But I am interested in seeing how the responses change. I'm also curious as to, whether or not these questions really apply to all the different types of presentations. Like, for instance, I wonder about just how much an expo presenter really can tick all the boxes of the elements that we'd like to see in a presentation when they have such a fast-moving, at times, a fast-moving crowd passing by their tables. And it's not always as easy for a seminar speaker to incorporate a hands-on or interactive element to their presentation as much as we encourage them to do that whenever possible. So I still have questions that I'd like to see answered from these results and using this again in the future. I'm also really curious about other elements such as the efficiency with which different kinds of rooms we have are used and the appropriateness of it. Is the movements of crowds working for people through the facilities that we have our events taking place in? All these kinds of observational type information, I see great potential for adapting this form for those purposes. And I really liked that this was really pretty unobtrusive, that these observations and thoughts could be captured and jotted down outside of the view of the people that are being observed. So there's you're less likely to make those people uncomfortable, and I really want people to be just focused on their experience and enjoying their experience and benefiting from that observation that some of our volunteers have. So I hope that our experience and sharing our experience has been helpful, and with that, I'll conclude. I'm happy to answer any questions whenever you want to do that part of this.
Yeah, that's perfect, Renee. We actually do have a couple minutes for questions. Okay. If you guys would, if you have a question for Renee, if you want to raise your hand, then Emma will unmute you so that you can talk to her directly. In the meantime, while we're waiting for that, Renee, you mentioned that you had the age of the field researcher noted on each of the forms. Have you guys had a chance yet, either formally or informally, to look at that and see if using people as young as 14 seems to give you equally good data or data that you're equally satisfied with?
In our informal review of them, they seem to really, we had various ones from, for instance, one seminar might produce 2 or 3 different forms. And they were, I felt that and there was only one 14-year-old that I recall, and those responses seem to match up pretty well, very similar to the feedback to the others in that particular session. So yeah, I felt as if their feedback was still very valuable.
Great. Emma, anybody else out there with questions?
One thing that the younger ones didn't do as much, although I have to say not as many people as I would like really wrote notes, but we did have a comment section. And the ones that were 17, 15, 14 didn't seem to write as many comments.
Okay.
And I do enjoy the comments.
All right, I'm just sending Emma a text to make sure she knows that we could not hear her a second ago if she was trying to talk. And Gina, if you are on the line and able to talk, I wanted to give you a minute just to reflect on what is similar or different between some of the feedback that Renee just shared and what your experiences were most recently trying to use the protocol. Hopefully she will dial back in. In the meantime, I am going to keep things moving. And Kaya, I am turning control over to you.
Hi, thanks. This is Kaya. I'm down at University of South Florida, St. Petersburg. And thank you for inviting me to speak here. So what we did several years ago, 3 years ago to be precise, and we haven't done it since then. And I just want to, before we start, give a little caveat. We haven't done it since then as problematic as some problems that we did have, not because of the method, but more due to several work things happened. So that just got in the way. But now we're here again, and I'm part of the evaluation committee, and my chair, I believe Karen Bronsberger, is one of the attendees here. So we're going to be moving forward with this. So what did we do? I can't move the slides forward.
Okay. Sorry about that. You should be good now.
Okay.
Hey.
Perfect. Thanks. So remember, this was 3 years ago. This was, I believe, before you got the national grant. So at the time there was cooperation, and Karen was working with, and Therese Burris was working with other different Science Festival communities, but there wasn't a standardized visitor survey yet. So we wanted to try a multi-method approach with a visitor survey, the exhibit survey, teacher survey for our school day, and add in an observation of visitors. Because we really wanted to triangulate what we were hearing to verify what we were learning in one was relevant to what we were learning in other ways. We were very interested in children's learning, interaction, and engaging. Interaction and engagement, as many of you probably know, is a proxy for learning. And with the observations, we thought that was a good way to measure were children actually engaging in the exhibits and how much? Were their parents facilitating the engagement with the children, or were they standing back? So we were looking at that kind of information. What did we do? We decided to do observation of family groups. Specifically, a child would be chosen under 13, and a tracker would follow that child and their family for 15 minutes or until they left the Science Festival. They had to be with an adult over 21 years, and so we'll talk about a little bit more about that later on. Now, why did we do it this way? I'm currently a librarian here at the university, but I have a background in museum studies, and this observation tracking is a method that's frequently used in museum studies. My colleagues on the evaluation committee, Karen is a marketing professor, so I'm sure she was well familiar with this types of method. And Anna Lewis, my colleague from the College of Education, was very interested in science education and learning. So here is our instrument. This was unobtrusive tracking, and this can make people a little bit nervous that we were following children throughout the Science Festival, so we did submit an IRB, but as this was considered an assessment, it wasn't, we were granted exemption from the IRB. Still, for good safety procedures, we only collected minimal demographics. Basically, if the part of the group, male, female, the number of adults or children in the group. Our trackers were instructed to keep a distance from the family so they could see what they were up to, but not actually overhear or get in the way of what the families were doing or saying. For example, if a child and their parents approached a robotics exhibit, they could see if the child was asking a question or saying something, but they couldn't overhear. So they weren't so physically close as to really interfere with what's going on. We had 4 different starting points for the trackers to determine a family that they could follow. These were the 4 different entrances to the Science Festival, the main entrances where they could go. So ideally, people would be just entering the Science Festival as they began their stay. We had our instrument loaded into SurveyMonkey, and we had iPads, not the iPads now that are part of the grant, but we had collected a group of iPads that we were hoping to tap into the Wi-Fi network to download to the university Wi-Fi network. As I said before, we were interested in tracking children less than 13 accompanied by an adult. We wanted to see how they were interacting. So was the child using the exhibit? Were they engaging? Were they playing with a robot? Or were they making soap? So were they doing something physical that they could see? Were they just looking or listening? We couldn't really differentiate when there's a looking versus listening, but were they looking like they were hearing, watching the presentation? How is that different from waiting, which was another thing that we tracked? Well, sometimes probably for a lot of the science festivals, certainly for ours, some exhibits, there might be rows and rows of people ahead before the child could actually get to the table to actually engage or participate. Or they might be just that little bit further back that they're just judgment call, waiting to actually use, listen, or participate. And then we put in photographing. Was the child working with their adult? Was the 2 of them working on it together? Was the adult doing it? And these were the type of information. Every single exhibit in our Science Fest, we assigned a unique number ahead of time. And these numbers were prominently displayed on the tents. So the trackers would be able to record the location that they went to and track what they were getting up to. They were also supposed to estimate how long they stayed at each exhibit and mark down the demographics. And then why did they leave? Did the family group leave the Science Festival? Did they enter our sister festival, Marine Quest, which goes on at the same time? Did they leave by trolley or something else? Or did the 15 minutes that we designated simply end? So here is the map of our Science Festival. All the trackers were provided with this map, and it just gives you a little bit of the layout of the land. So the ultimate goal for our pilot project doing this was 10 trackers to make 10 observations each for a total of 100. Now, unfortunately, we had some issues that happened that day. We had the iPads, and as many of you well know, Wi-Fi can be touch and go on these days. And we found that we simply could not access. The Wi-Fi was overwhelmed, and the iPads were completely useless. So the day of, I had to go and print out these survey instruments so that, and give the trackers clipboards that they could still try and collect the same data. This cost us time, energy, and the printed up was not as effective, obviously, as being able to enter it into the iPads would be. Trackers. The St. Pete Science Festival really relies on volunteers from the local universities, University of South Florida, St. Petersburg, Eckerd College, to name two. We also rely on volunteers from the general public. Volunteers sign up ahead of time, and all volunteers were offered training ahead of time. But that year, very few volunteers actually showed up for the training. The day of, we had instructed all the volunteers to come ahead of time, so I gave them a rundown of the training and the procedures, and that mostly went well, but that still wasn't enough. Some students were awesome. Some of the volunteers were awesome. They loved the tracking. They did the tracking and the surveying, and they found the tracking was more interesting because you're collecting anthropological, sociological information on what people are actually doing. Other trackers were just shy, and they were just scared of approaching people in the visitor survey, that they wanted to do something unobtrusively, that they didn't have to interact with other people. However, some problems that we had, one student stayed with one family for over an hour. He just didn't process that it was supposed to be only 15 minutes. So he collected rich data of a family's entire trip to the Science Festival, and of course he didn't collect much else other than that. Another issue that we had is that we had one volunteer from the general public. Most of the volunteers for this observation were the university students, but we had at that time one volunteer from the general public. And I just kind of felt that I had to turn him away. He was an earnest 40-ish gentleman, and you know, this can be a sensitive issue, sensitive method, and my mom radar went off, and I was like, no family, no adults going to be happy or feel good about this gentleman. He just would be noticed, and that kind of ick factor would come up that I just didn't want to go there. So he just got reassigned and wasn't appropriate for the tracking. So what other issues? There are no do-overs, and that is a big issue. When I've done this method in other forums, such as museums, or we've done it here in our library, we have a lot of time to troubleshoot, to test the instrument, test the process, update and revise. With the Science Festival, it's really a one-day thing, so you don't have the time to make corrections. As much as you can try and anticipate everything, as we saw from the Wi-Fi and needing print, we did have unforeseen issues. Other issues that we had, the Science Festival had some exhibitor no-shows. So we had all of the exhibitors assigned a unique number that we tracked. But when it came to the day of, some of the exhibitors seeing empty tables in more prominent locations where they would rather be, or perhaps in the shade. This is St. Petersburg, Florida, and the heat can be very hot. We had some exhibitors move tables. And at the day, we realized that, and we didn't have someone that would should have gone around and ground truth which exhibitors were actually at which physical tables, so that the numbers that we assigned were actually true to the numbers prominently displayed on the tents. And we didn't do that, so we have problems with our data that we can't match any of the exhibitors to the actual numbers that were tracked. So the day of, you really need someone to be able to handle these unforeseens and do some ground truthing. And just record who showed and who doesn't show. Because later on we want to differentiate between exhibitors that didn't show and exhibitors that didn't attract any attention or interest from the family grouping. Then we come to analysis of data, and I didn't want to go into this too much, but we relied on a volunteer who had wanted to heavily work on the data entry and the analysis of the data, and life happens, and it really didn't get completely done, and it took a long time, and the data, I've only started looking at it right now, what we have, and as problematic it is for this presentation, I'll talk to you. So, what did we find? Just a simple overview of what you can find from this method. We had 59 complete observations. We found that close to 50% of the people entered at the same one location, which is by our Harbor Hall. So where they started potentially had a great impact on what exhibits they visited. From tracking, around a 33% lasted more than 15 minutes. Within the first 15 minutes, a lot of them left Science Fest. They could have gone to, we had right near the entrance all the food trucks, so if they went to the food trucks, that was counted as ending the tracking. So there were different ways. It was really during that 15 minutes, they didn't necessarily stay for the full time. We found 59% of the students, or the children that were tracked, were male, 41 were female. 90% guessed to be around elementary age, and 10% guessed to be around middle school. The vast majority of the children were in small groups of one adult with 1 or 2 children in the group. More interestingly, during those 15 minutes, around a third visited one exhibit, another third visited 2 exhibits, then some groups, starting getting smaller proportion, were quicker at visiting the exhibits. 22% visited 3 exhibits, stopped at 3 exhibits, obviously for not very long. 10% stopped at 4 different exhibits, not for very long, and 5% stopped at 5 exhibits during those 15 minutes. So they were really stopping, moving on, stopping, moving on. Overall, the children stopped at 45 of the 100 exhibits that were there that day. 30 of these exhibits that we saw the children stop at garnered multiple stops. So multiple children went to the same exhibits. The same exhibit, or the exhibit that featured of our sample the most visits, got 15 visits from different groups. But the average was 5.5 stops from the ones that actually got any visits. And again, I can't tell you what exactly those exhibits were. One of the interesting things that I did see was from the numbers, because all the numbers were correlated side by side, was that the students or the children and their families visited exhibits in clusters. So the exhibits that really got the most stops were all side by side with each other. So looking at the data and the numbers that they were, we could see that I could see that there were actually 2 clumps, 2 prominent clumps situated around the Science Festival that people actually stopped a lot, and then there were 3 areas where really the exhibits really only got 1 or no stops. So people must have just walked right on by. And again, that gets back to the point of you need to ground truth from that day. Why was that? Was it because they were poster presentations? Was it because that those exhibits or those tables were empty? Or were they potentially uninteresting exhibits? So what did they do? We found that 51% of the students were just passively looking at the exhibit or the exhibitor. 32% actually used or engaged or did something. And 17% stopped and waited. Ironically, those that the waiting was really prominent for the first stop and those that made it to 5 different exhibits. So they were very interested. Also, the other interesting thing was it was the second stop that showed the highest level of engagement. So they might have waited or watched at the first exhibit that they went to, but it was actually at the second stop that people actually, the children actually approached and did something. So what is the takeaway message, the value of this process? Well, academic value, our evaluation committee for the St. Pete Science Fest when we did this was we were interested in research and we wanted to triangulate and learn how students were learning, to verify that they were learning and that they were engaging. So this was very important to us. The assessment value that we can see is the verifying, the multi-method. We have from the visitor what people say. They can say, this was my favorite exhibit. Did you actually engage and use the exhibit? But we can actually try and independently see, are they doing what they say they're doing? And that's important. Another important thing for, for assessment value, sorry, I went away one slide forward, is potentially this information has not been used and problems with the data, it shouldn't be used, but nope, we want to go back.
Oh, sorry.
Yep. Were people waiting too long? Because this was observation and tracking, you could actually see, were they waiting too long? Where did they get lost? And then try and get some indication on why some exhibits had visitors and some not. Perhaps it was the location. If close to 50% of our visitors were entering at the same location and those exhibits were the ones that got the most hits, the most feedback, then that's a very prominent location and could affect the organization. Or perhaps they had nothing interactive. So, future plans. I haven't been part of the Science Festival evaluation committee since then, and Karen and I haven't talked on whether or not we're going to do this method again. I don't know. Should we consider, I would promote that we simplify the instrument, collect less data that would be more robust, and collect more of it. Obviously, not have to connect to the Wi-Fi would be ideal, and also still be able to download into a computer would be ideal. The university student trackers were great, but they needed more proper training. And I think afterwards, when it comes to the data entry and analysis, volunteers are wonderful, but there needs to be a little bit more vested ownership, I think, on my part or the committee's part to make sure that it gets done and utilized. Finally, my little preaching to the choir, I always have felt that qualitative information based on observation on what people actually really do is important for both research and assessments. I think it provides richer, more grounded data that than visitor surveys, which provides a more representational general overview. And also we want the visitors to learn. So we want to know that the festivals are navigable, and hopefully with careful observation and tracking, this is what it can do. So that is my presentation, and any questions?
I'm actually going to suggest that we hold questions. Actually, if you have them, go ahead and type them into the chat. We're running a little bit long, and so I'm going to keep going, but hopefully we'll have time for questions at the end. I'll try to speed through what I have. What we wanted to do is spend a little time at the end today talking about other options. So if you're not sure that either of the two possibilities that you've heard so far are the right fit for you, or if you don't want to do this at all, there are other options for things that you could think about or things you could rely on. And so I'm going to try to go through those relatively quickly, and hopefully we will have some time for questions at the end. So one big question is why bother? And that was a question that we ended up, it wasn't so much why bother, it was why bother doing it again. So when we collected these data at the North Carolina Science Festival in 2012, they provided great information for us, similar to what Renee was sharing about where were the strengths and how our scientists were communicating with the public, and where were places that maybe they needed some additional guidance and support. But once you know that, then there's this big question of whether you want to continue to put evaluation resources toward that. And we have not made the decision to do that again since 2012. I think we probably will start using the method again next year. And we have people who want to try it this year. And so I wanted to spend a little bit of time reviewing some of the results from the publication that Denise and I had come out last year for two reasons. One, because I think it's helpful to know how these data have already been analyzed. Two, if you don't think this is something you do want to spend your resources on, you may not have to, because there is now at least one piece in the literature that talks directly about science festivals and how these data work in science festivals. And we could think about recommendations that come from those. And then is that the Science Live report said that, one thing that we are all craving is cheat sheets. That there's literature out there. None of us have enough time to learn everything we would want or need to know, and so we're gonna be your human cheat sheet for the next few minutes and talk about what we think are some of the important results from this particular study, and then also talk about another possibility for a protocol as well. So the mystery shopper protocol looks at two buckets of things. It looks at booth logistics and how the booth is set up and what happened at the booth in a basic descriptive way, and then it focuses particularly on the scientist interactions at the booth and the number of best practices that that scientist is displaying as part of their interaction with the public. One of the things that we did was start to look at some of the correlations that Renee mentioned, and looking at how our different data points from the protocol related to one another. And I wanted to point out what we found in demonstrations and hands-on activities. One of the surprises for us was that time spent at a booth was not related to booths that had either a demo or a hands-on. We were sort of suspecting that people would spend more time at those booths, and it turned out that they just didn't. The overall rating that mystery shoppers provided for booths varied and was higher when there was a demonstration or when there was a hands-on activity, but there was an important and interesting caveat in relation to that hands-on activity piece. We asked our mystery shoppers to indicate whether they thought the hands-on activity was designed for kids, whether it was designed for all audience, or whether it just didn't happen at all. And having something designed for all audiences ended up being really important. It was important for the data collection itself, because if we had a young adult going up to a table that was really designed for little kids, it sometimes created an awkward situation where they felt like they were sort of this creepy grown-up who was at a kid's table. And so part of that may be coming through in the ratings. We didn't necessarily think the focus point or the perceived focal point and target audience of the interaction of the hands-on activity was going to matter, but it turns out it did. So only in cases where there were activities that were designed for all audiences do we see a relationship between having a hands-on activity and the overall rating. And then we had a question about whether the mystery shopper thought they understood the big idea of the booth. What was it all about? Did they think they got the point? That was just a simple yes, no. And that related to having hands-on activities as well. So people are feeling like it's easier to grasp what the big idea is in the presence of a hands-on activity than when that happens to be missing from a festival booth. We did look at correlations between the number of best practices and scientist interactions and what happened in the booth exchange with the mystery shopper. So we had, I can't remember, I think it was probably like 8 different best practices that we looked for evidence of, and that was just a yes-no checklist similar to the one that Renee mentioned. We summed all of those into an overall best practices score and then correlated that with how long the mystery shopper spent at the booth rating, which was a 5-point scale similar to what we have attendees do, so that poor to excellent scale, and then whether or not they understood the big idea. And the more best practices that were displayed during an exchange, the better all of these ratings look. And so there is a nice positive relation between the use of these best practices and what happens and how long people spend at booths. All right. The other thing that is interesting and kind of cool about these data is that the mystery shopper data are different than those that we get from attendees. And we would expect that. That's part of the rationale for why you would consider sending in mystery shoppers in the first place, is that you can train these guys to be very focused on the exact things that you care about the most. So if we think of all of ourselves as service providers, we can tell them as a service provider, here are the things that are most important to me about this interaction, and that's what they focus in on, that's what their ratings are based on, and that's what their open-ended comments are based on. And so we ended up with this really nice normal-looking distribution across the rating scale that we use for our mystery shopper data, and that distribution is quite different from what we typically see from attendees, which are really high ratings, so positively skewed toward that high end of the rating scale. Now, these data are great from a satisfaction standpoint, but they're not necessarily going to provide you with the information that you want and need to know to improve your festival. The mystery shopper data did that. So when we looked at the kinds of information that mystery shoppers were providing for us in their rationale statements for why they pitched the rating that they did, it was often about the scientist interaction, whether there was a hands-on activity, whether it was a demonstration, and the quality things that we cared the most about from the festival perspective. So there's a better match there. Okay. Amy Gratt-Nelson has mentioned to me for years now that there's another protocol out there, and I did not pay it enough attention until very recently. So apologies to Amy. Part of the reason I didn't pay attention to it, and maybe you've gone past it as well, is that it's called an observation protocol for educational field days. When you open this article up, though, and look at it, it's a festival. It's organized slightly differently. These educational field days are a scientist at sort of a booth table kind of a thing, interacting with classes of students, but those interactions last for about half an hour. But this is an observation protocol that has a really nice amount of reliability and validity work behind it. It was published in 2011. There are, I think, some more recent citations as well, and it's based on best practices in environmental education. These are what some of the items look like, and I'm just going to go through these really quickly. I can send the protocol to folks afterward. They look at what the presentation included. So this is all about what the scientist is doing. It's broken up into 3 sections: a beginning, some stuff that could have happened throughout, and then things that need to have happened by the end, and that's where things like the big idea. Okay? But you can see here that it's about how the scientists pulled the students into the content, how they managed the group during that, and then how they made sure they got what the key content points were by the end of the observation. It looks at teaching strategies, and this is just a, check this off if it ever occurred. And there are definitions for each of these, so you can see demonstration and hands-on activity here, which are similar to what we focused on with the mystery shoppers. And then I really like this scale for audience engagement. So there are people are listening when they're supposed to, and excited and enthused when they're supposed to be, and whether that also carries over to the action part of what happened at the booth, and then quantifying that based on how many people in each class were doing that thing during the observation period itself. And so I like that scale and that approach for that particular piece. And then they had a problems and challenges section. And this group of items is longer than what you see here. It ended up picking up things that were often in the booth logistics category for our festival protocol. So this is a really nice protocol, I think. It does a great job of balancing between what the scientist is doing and what the students in this case were doing. Whereas the mystery shopper protocol focuses more on the scientist interaction itself. So they're sort of designed for different purposes and give you different kinds of data. But if you're more comfortable with a traditional observation protocol instead of the mystery shopper process, then this might be a good fit for your festival expos as well. And that's where I want to have Emma launch our first poll question. So when we met in January of 15, this mystery shopping idea was one of the things that people were most intrigued about, and it was something that people wanted to see us pursue as a community. What we want to do is just check in with just the idea of observation overall and think about whether you guys are interested in trying to collect observation data for your festival at some point, or whether that's just not the right fit for you. And so Emma, if you could go ahead and launch the poll. As you're choosing, keep in mind that this is not a commitment. It's just a pulse check for us. So we just want to see if people are still interested in this idea, and then we can start unpacking how to pursue that. And Emma, I will wait for you to chime in when you close the poll and have results.
All right, I'm going to close the poll and share the results. So everyone should be able to see that.
I cannot, so if you could just tell me how things shook out.
Okay. So 71% said yes, we would like to do this at some point in the coming years, and 29% said they are not interested. So I think that's a pretty good.
Yeah, nice. Okay, so there are a few things that we might consider as next steps go. One is to determine the purpose that we're most interested in. And again, this is going to come back to evaluation use, right? And what do we want to do with these data? Are we more interested in that insider perspective of the mystery shopper, or are we more interested in the outside observer point of view that looks at the scientists and the public as they're attending booths? And that's going to, Emma, if you could launch the second poll. Again, this is non-binding, but we want to think about getting a pulse check on which of these general methods feels the most of interest as well. And then we can think about how to revise protocols and procedures to find a way for this to happen for people who are interested in pursuing it. All right, so if you guys can do a quick vote. And Emma, if you could close that down as soon as you think you're able.
All right, I'm going to close the poll and share the results. So 33% said that they would be interested in mystery shopper participation in scientist interactions at the booth, and 67% said that they were interested in outside observer data on both scientists and the public at the booth.
Nice. All right. So then if we think about the next steps on this list, regardless of which direction we go, one thing that we need to think about is how to establish reliability. So if you took a quick look at the observer protocol from Carlson, Heimlich, and Sorkstein, you will have noticed that there's a sort of a Likert scale on there that includes things like this was very well done, this was exceptionally done. They have started to do some definitional work around that 5-point scale, and I think have started to establish reliability with the 5 points as well. But we would need to consider doing that in our own context. I think it's also, I wanted to come back to a point that Kaya made, and that is that the protocol that Carlson and that team published is 2 or 3 pages long, and we wouldn't be able to accomplish all of that in a 5-minute interaction. And that protocol was designed for a 30-minute interaction. But thinking about how to narrow down on what makes the most sense, what we care about the most, and how to observe those interactions between scientists and the public might be a fun way to take this work forward a little bit. The final thing to mention is that both of the protocols that are in the literature now include some comparison between what the observer found and what the attendee found. But neither of those studies had a direct alignment between the exact kind of things that the observer was reporting and the exact kind of things that the attendee was reporting. And so they're just approximations and estimates of what is similar about these data collection methods and what's different. And so that might be another area of sort of fruitful exploration for us as we think about how to build off of the attendee survey that we already have by pulling in a companion piece that looks at scientist interactions and what booth participants are contributing to that interaction. So I think I'm going to leave it there for today. We do not have time for questions that are live, but if you guys have a question, put it in the chat and I will try to farm it out to whichever team, and then maybe we can send sort of a composite list of questions and responses to people in the days ahead. So use the chat function. I see a couple of you have already done that, which is fantastic. Type any questions that you have for Renee, for Kaya, or for myself, and we will try to pull together responses to that and send it out. Thank you again to Renee and Miles and Kaya for spending some time helping us learn about your experiences today. And thanks to all of you for tuning in. We will see you next month.